Hi guys, next video. Welcome to my library recording room again. And once again, we're in the green drawing room at Windsor Castle for looking at John Locke. We looked in the last video on Thomas Hobbes, kind of briefly, and this time I'm going to look a little bit more at John Locke. Now, John Locke is one of those guys that we all kind of feel like we already know something about what he said. But sometimes what he actually said gets lost in the mix. Locke is an interesting fellow. I love Locke for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons I do is because Locke doesn't actually write anything that's published until he's age 60. There's one of these historical myths that it's not totally a myth, but it's one of these ideas that comes out of history that if you're going to do anything worthwhile, you have to do it by age 33. After all, Christ is going to be on the cross and do his ministry by the time he's 33. You had to have Napoleon, who's emperor, by 33. Alexander does his conquest by 33. And there's this magical number 33. But there are a lot of guys who do a lot of things after 33, and Locke is one of them. Locke actually doesn't do, he's a figure, he's known, but he's certainly not strikingly known for his thought and his political ideas until after he's in his 60s. He was a Puritan. He was Oxford trained. He had training in law and to a degree in theology as well. He'd had a lot of exposure during the Civil War period in England of the 1640s, 1650s to the ideas of the Levelers. And the Levelers are a really interesting group who we don't always give a lot of press to, but they're certainly significant in the English Civil War because they want to get rid of all private property. Now, when we look at Hobbes, we don't hear a lot of echoes of that. You don't see him reacting a lot to that. He's actually dealing more with a reaction against a lot of the resistance theories, more what we get with Hobbes, as well as more systematic ideas. He's actually going to wind up working for a nobleman by the name of Anthony Ashley Cooper, a name that I knew long before I knew who Locke was, actually, because I'm from the sovereign state of South Carolina. And South Carolina had 8 lords proprietor, and one of those 8 lords proprietor was the Earl of Shaftesbury, whose full name was Anthony Ashley Cooper. And the 2 great rivers that run into the city of Charleston are the Ashley and the Cooper, named after the Earl of Shaftesbury. Now, the Earl of Shaftesbury was very much a significant operator in the years of the 1670s. By the way, you want to notice here that Locke is considerably younger than Hobbes. Hobbes is born in the year of Armada. Locke's not born until 1632. So when, in fact, Charles I is executed in 1649, he's just not all that old. He's about 17. So he lives through the period of the Civil War. He lives through all of what goes on under Cromwell. He lives through the bringing back of Charles II. He lives through the problems of Charles II, James II, and he lives through the Glorious Revolution all the way through into William and Mary's reign, and quite significantly into their reign, actually. The reality is that Locke has a different set of circumstances, much like what we saw the differences between Augustine and Aquinas. It's a different set of circumstances. Even though he's close in time to Hobbes, he's going to have a different set of realities. Now, Locke is going to work for, in fact, Anthony Ashley Cooper as his personal secretary. That also means that he's going to be privy to all of the goings on of Lord Shaftesbury. Shaftesbury is going to be a part of the convention parliament. He's going to be part of the assembly that asks William and Mary to come in the Glorious Revolution. He's very much part of that process. He's going to be on the run for a while from Charles II and James II in the Netherlands, and John Locke's going to go with him at that period. So they're both going to be kind of in exile for a while. And Shaftesbury is going to be very much a founding member of the Whig Party, this group that believes in the foundations of liberty. First, before it becomes the Whigs, they are the country party, not the court party. The court party is very much in line with what the king wants, whereas the country party is going to be involved in a number of things. And by 1682, they're rather frustrated with Charles II. And the plot against him is not so much against him, but as to change the succession in favor of one of Charles II's illegitimate sons, the Duke of Monmouth. And the Duke of Monmouth is, and by the way, Charles II is only 3 years away from dying in 1685. And the Duke of Monmouth is the eldest of Charles II's illegitimate children. Charles II famously, of course, does not have any legitimate children, but his eldest is the Duke of Monmouth, who tries to take the throne. He's unsuccessful in the rebellion, and it goes nowhere, and he's going to be killed in that process. But when in fact things go very badly with James II, and there is the asking of William and Mary to come over, particularly William of Orange, who has in fact an army with him, those who are going to be successful in making this transition happen and then are going to be part of the creation of the revolutionary settlement. Shaftesbury and Locke will return to England as part of the Glorious Revolution with William and Mary. It's at this point that Locke's writing career really begins to take off. And in 1690, he's going to publish his key works. Excuse me. The material's not pouring, it's just the late hour. Sorry about that. And he's going to write not only the essay on concerning human understanding, which you probably have encountered at some point in a psychology class, if nowhere else, as also the 2 treatises on government. Now, the first treatise on government, as we'll see in just a second, is not something very much any people read anymore. It's always the second treatise, but he does write 2 long essays. Now, those are actually the short titles. It's the 1690s, and nobody's in a hurry, and their titles can take up pages, much less the rest of the writing. Okay. His first treatise is called In the Former, the False Principles and the Foundation of Sir Robert Filmer and His Followers Are Detected and Overthrown. Now, if you remember, Filmer we talked about last week when we were talking about some of the ideas of surrounding absolute monarchy and some of the issues around resistance theory that came later from it. Filmer's going to be the author of Patriarchy, and Locke's going to take him apart. He's going to be arguing with Filmer a lot. He's going to argue that this patriarchy analogy is utterly faulty. It just doesn't work. He does not like this. He's going to argue against it rather thoroughly. He's going to say patriarchal power is only absolute over a child who doesn't have reason. And I'm here to tell you, as a mother, you don't always have absolute power over them. You can, but it also is a process where you're trying to teach them reason. So it doesn't work out quite the way that these guys who are theorizing are saying. And he's also going to argue that it certainly doesn't work over adult children, and it doesn't even work over one's wife. Okay? The reason of an adult limits any authority over them. And he includes in that, to a degree, women. And I'll talk about why he includes them in that in a minute. Now, unlike Hobbes, Locke is going to get into the depths of theology along the way. He's not afraid to reference theological arguments. In fact, much of what he does is almost outlined kind of like an exegetical argument on Scripture. And he's going to use Scripture on occasion, but he's particularly going to be doing a great exegesis of the problems in Filmer's Patriarchy. His second one is called The Latter is an Essay Concerning the True Original Extent and End of Civil Government. Now, the first one, what I just said is all anybody ever needs to do most of the time, unless you're involved in studying the 1600s and governing theories at this point. Okay, other than that, not right away. Instead, we tend to focus on the second one, which is the second one is less bound by the specifics of somebody else's writings and of time and place, although it's certainly affected by it. The second treatise is aimed more at Hobbes because he's going to disagree with Hobbes on some rather fundamental points, but he doesn't ever mention Hobbes. And at the same time, he's really going to be looking more generally to justify the Glorious Revolution, even if, and Hobbes is in the background, but Hobbes is not nearly as important. Now, so what we want to do next is we want to look at some commonalities with Hobbes and some differences with him. So, like I said, there are a number of commonalities, and there we go. When we look at the comparison to Hobbes, let's spend some time on what they do have in common. Because Locke and Hobbes are going to be both talking about a couple of very key concepts: social contract, states of nature, those ideas that are part of the discussions of government in the Enlightenment are very much going to be some things that both of them talk about. The first of these is this business of man and the state of nature. That's the first commonality that they have, is that they're talking about this kind of point when there is no government, okay? And that's their commonality. Now, that's where they start, but what they mean by that is a whole other thing. They don't mean the same thing when they talk about man and the state of nature, which is really, really important to keep in mind. They also talk about government comes through the consent of the government, through the social contract. They both believe in a social contract. They believe that God is giving power to the government through the consent of those who are being governed. So Hobbes, even though he's going to believe in a Leviathan, that the government, once in existence, has to grant rights, that you can't just then break the social contract, because then you go back to the state of nature and all the chaos that it ensues. The state is conventional, it's mechanical, it's not a natural entity. We are a century removed from the concepts of the body politic, and they're just not really arguing for that any longer. They're both kind of materialists, they're both empiricists, they're both nominalists. They think that these concepts are things that are being developed and they have to be described and defined, that they are not something that's innate. And he's an empiricist, like many, many English philosophers. It's going to be something that's about practicality. It's about what he can see in front of him. And we see this very clearly with Locke and with Hobbes. But there are some significant differences. The first is that the third of Locke's great works is the reasonableness of Christianity. And he's going to directly talk about this. And he's going to try to put reason and faith together in his discussions here. And he's not afraid to actually talk about that. He doesn't see that as a barrier to doing good theory. Whereas Hobbes is going to be a lot more secular in his language, even if he's still a man of faith, which he is. He's going to talk about man and the state of nature, and he means, like I said, something rather different than Hobbes. Hobbes sees man and the state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, that it's all about power, and that's going to mean a lot of struggle for materials, for everything. Whereas Locke thinks that man and the state of nature is still rational and still, in fact, under natural law. Because for Locke, natural law supersedes the social contract. Natural law, moral law, God's moral law, still operates in the state of nature. Man may not always follow it, but it is always there. And that's still there. And that supersedes the social contract. Reason is also still operational in the state of nature. Otherwise, you would never create a social contract, as far as Locke's concerned. And he sees there's a difference between the state of nature and the state of war. And Hobbes kind of sees those two kind of is merging. But once again, that's the world he's dealt with, and context does affect these things. Now, Locke, interestingly, though, he believes that natural law supersedes the social contract, and natural law exists without government and even in the state of nature. He also believes that man is has no innate ideas, that ideas must has to be taught. Okay. So he's going to believe very heavily in nurture. Okay. In fact, he believes that the idea that things are inherent in one and not discoverable by reason leads to intolerance. Okay, so we're starting to hear echoes of the Enlightenment thought here, all about reason, reasonableness of Christianity, that your reason is still operational in the state of nature. Nobody in the 1640s and 1650s thinks that reason is actually driving all of this. Okay, there's too much chaos going on in the middle of the 17th century. It's the reason why historians call it that period, the whole of the 1640s through the 1660s, the 17th century crisis. And not just because of what's going on in Europe. We've got crises in Africa and Asia and the Americas. It's a constant. Part of it has to do with climate changes of the period, but a lot of it has to do with just civil strife. He says that natural law, while it still supersedes the social contract, while it's always there in the state of nature, it still has to be taught to the next generation. And Locke is going to write a number of different letters to people about education. And this is where you start to see some of this come into play, is that he's going to have this real concept about education is key, because you have to teach the next generation what the natural law is. It's there always, but you still have to learn it. Okay. The child who is not taught that stealing is wrong is not going to know the natural law. So you still have to teach them that. Okay. Which brings us to Locke's idea about the social contract. Now, as part of the social contract, he looks at this rather differently. He says that government doesn't eliminate a state of war, that governments don't actually change everything. They don't solve every problem. Governments can, as far as Locke is concerned, act illegally and use force without right. He does not believe that a government, just by nature of existing, has the right to use force on everybody. Okay. But there is a concept of justice and natural law that supersedes the social contract. Thereby, there can be reasons that a government is violating natural law and violating justice. The social contract for him is really a fiduciary agreement. And what he means by that is that it is something that a fiduciary agreement is one in which it's a contract in which one person transfers ownership of something, of an asset, to someone else or to something else. And that's what the social contract is, that it's not somehow that you just randomly give this up, but in fact, we have given over parts of this to this. Okay. The fiduciary is in charge and can exercise ownership rights on his behalf and can transfer things to a new part, but you don't lose the sense in a fiduciary agreement that those rights actually, or that asset originally belonged to somebody else. Okay. Which gives him the idea that of popular sovereignty, that sovereignty relies with the people, not with the government or the monarch. And that means that the government itself is already limited, not because of something the government does, but because of the nature of the social contract. Hobbes' social contract says that the government is unlimited, that the government has all the power, and the only rights the people have are those given to them by the government. Government only has the rights for Locke and powers that are given to it and designated to it by, in fact, the people. The contract for him has two parts. The first is the political contract that creates government. That piece can be broken, okay? The political contract creates a specific type of government, and that can be broken and changed and created again. The social contract creates the society, which is not specifically tied to the government. And I gave you this little diagram here that how he's kind of arguing this is that the social contract has is such that the people can create an agreement amongst themselves to protect their rights, and they give some rights to the kings, but if the kings misuse power, then the people can in fact overthrow the kings or the government or whoever and put in a new one that will protect their rights, and they can give them power again. So that is a cycle that he sees that can be replaced, because like in a fiduciary agreement, the rights of the government are held in trust. They hold them, but only certain rights are handed over. Locke is a precursor to Edmund Burke on this one, because Edmund Burke is actually going to see some of the same issues. He's going to argue that liberty is an entailed inheritance, one that cannot be alienated and cannot be sold. And it's a lot about the same kind of property law kind of thinking. For Locke, other rights are going to be retained by the individual. Some things are not given to the government. Government might want them. They don't have them. Okay. And if the trust is violated, then the revolution is justified. And you can hear very clearly that he is justifying what's happened with James II being overthrown in favor of his daughter and son-in-law. It's very clear here. But it's the same kind of language that, of course, the American Revolution will use. But the question is, why do you create a contract at all? Well, because Locke is not entirely an optimist about human nature, because there is a natural law that has to be taught, and some people will reject the natural law. And you need an impartial common authority for justice. And that's what a government's supposed to be. And once again, we get this concept of justice that we started out the semester with Plato. For him, government has no other end but the preservation of property. He's going to hear the levelers, but the idea of the levelers of eliminating private property and taking away private property is something that he's never totally comfortable with. For him, the rights of man are life and liberty, moral liberty, freedom to make choices, but it's also property. And property is actually this important one, because property allows you to secure the other two. Now, Thomas Jefferson is going to substitute pursuit of happiness for property, because he doesn't want to guarantee everybody property. But really, for Locke, that's the key piece. So Locke's government looks a little different than sometimes we think it might, because he's going to be so concentrated on property. Locke believes that originally all property was probably in common, but it was not supposed to remain that way. And here's where he starts taking off in a different track from the levelers. The levelers also believe property is really, really important. They just want everybody to have the same amount. Okay. And there are going to be a lot of these guys in the Enlightenment era who very much believe that property is the key. The physiocrats are going to believe that property, land, is the basis of all wealth, and there's no other basis, and that you should base your currency on land, not on any kind of bullion. Now, for Locke, the world belongs to those who are industrious and rational. Again, these are the people who are going to get ahead. These are the people who are going to make the right decisions and make things go well. Lateral law limited the amount of individual property, that you shouldn't have so much that you are monopolizing from everyone else. But you have a right of unlimited accumulation. You could go ahead and get more, but there's going to be naturally just a limit that you can get to, and you can't get any more. We're not going to get into debate on capitalism today, but that's his idea. He says all men need checks on them, even monarchs. And this is why you have to have limited government. This is an interesting thing because both Hobbes and Locke both hear you still hear echoes of Augustine that government is necessary. And government's necessary because everybody needs checks on them. But after all, Locke is a Puritan. If Locke is a Puritan, the Puritans have Calvinist leanings just like Hobbes. Okay. But he's actually not he's going to kind of move away a little bit from Puritanism because he's going to be a little bit more tolerant than some of the Puritans in some ways. At any rate, democratic principle rotates through those in legislature. And what that means is that the democracy is not supposed to be direct. In other words, people in legislature, the people who are making laws, change over time, and that's a lot of what you see here. He wants a limitation on the duration of legislative sessions because the longer, and this is coming directly out of the Civil War period because you've got the long parliament that's elected from 1640 and is still the only one that's been legitimately elected in 1660. That's too long. You need a limit on the duration of legislative sessions so that you can have regular elections and a rotation. He also recommends a separation of powers because he's also seen that, quite frankly, Parliament can be just as abusive as a monarch. It doesn't matter. You've got to have a balance between them. And if there's not a balance, you have a serious problem. This is one of the reasons why when the settlement is created, the revolutionary settlement was created in the 1690s, and the revolutionary settlement for the Glorious Revolution in England is not one piece of legislation. The Bill of Rights we always hear about, and that's certainly critical. But there are also several other pieces of legislation that require regular parliamentary meetings that specify how long. They create an independent executive in the monarch that is funded separately apart from Parliament so that they can operate independently as a check on Parliament. Locke is actually very much a believer in what I'm just talking about. He wants an executive authority that has both kind of a federal power as well as the ability to execute the laws. The executive authority is over domestic affairs. The federative is more international, that they can deal with federations and deal with properties overseas and things of this nature. He sees, in fact, that in executive matters, okay, in matters of trying to execute the law and put the law into practice, that there was a prerogative right. There was some rights given to the monarch or to the governing party that didn't actually have lots of written down things, that there were some things that there were the rights of this to say this, I want you to do it this way. Okay. And there were some things there. Locke is an interesting fellow because his emphasis on the kind of balance within government is going to be something that's picked up by other theorists in the Enlightenment. Montesquieu is going to talk about it some, even Voltaire is. And they're going to talk about these questions because they're going to be critical for the foundation of other governments eventually. Not because they talk about them, but that will come out of it. Locke is foundational. He's hard to get away from. He's hard to over-exaggerate. But he is kind of in tension with Hobbes. And you really kind of need to understand them both because they're going to both look at the state of nature and see key pieces in the social contract. But they're going to come at them from rather different perspectives.